Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial. So today what I'm going to be showing you is how you can create an image carousel like the one you currently see on screen using just HTML, CSS and vanilla JavaScript. So no external framework like Bootstrap or anything like that. So a feature of this carousel is that it has user controls at the bottom here. So if I click on one of these circles, it's going to skip to that particular image. You'll also notice that there's a transition between the images, so when there is an image change, it's not too harsh. And one more thing I want to show you before you see how it's done is if you increase the number of images in the markup like this, so just increased it from 3 to 5, then the navigation controls automatically adjust and populate the appropriate number of circles. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, we'll be walking through that. Okay, so let's talk about the markup first of all. So all of the content is contained within this main element, which I've given an ID of carousel. And within this element, the setup is to have images that are going to be in the carousel as direct children of the carousel element. And then the final element after the images is a nav container, which is going to contain a div where the description for each image is going to go, and also a div that's going to contain the dots which are used for the navigation. So for each of the images, you're going to want to set an src to the path of the image, and also a description attribute that's going to contain the text that's going to appear with the image just above the user navigation. So for each of the images, you're going to want to set an src attribute to the path of the image. You're also going to want to set a description attribute that's going to contain the text that appears on top of the image above the user control. And I'm making this a data attribute by using the data hyphen syntax here. So the name of this data attribute is desk. And the reason I'm doing this is because it makes it easier to select in JavaScript later. And finally, you want to add a class with the value of active to the very first image in the carousel. Okay, so that is it for the markup. Now, before moving to JavaScript, I'm going to talk through the CSS quickly because this is really important for getting the image carousel working. So the way that images come and go and also the navigation controls work is essentially using some trickery in terms of adding and removing an active class from those elements. So first of all, I'm saying that the width and height of the main carousel container should be 600 by 400. Next, I'm saying that the images inside the carousel, the initial display value of those should all be set to none, so none of them will be visible at first. And the width and the height of each of those images should be inherited from carousel. So each of the images, the width and height is going to be set to 600 by 400. And then what object fit cover is doing is it's making the images cover that space that's been inherited from carousel. And finally, position is set to fixed, because we want some content to appear on top of each image in a foreground layer. Now in the next selection, I'm selecting only the images inside carousel that currently have the active class applied to them, so that's only going to be one image at a time, the one that should be visible to a user, and therefore I'm setting the display to block. So this display block is only going to be set to one image at a time. The other images are all going to be display none. So we're going to be rotating the active class around with JavaScript. And then the animation is applied here. So the name is fade in, 1.5 seconds. And the animation is from an opacity of 0.8 to 1. So you can play around with that, make it a bit longer, or change the opacity. I found this to be a fairly good setup that's quite easy on the eye without taking too long. Now we move on to the navigation element that has embedded in it the description and dots elements. So we're styling this container here. So first of all, I'm inheriting the height and width, so that's also going to be the same as the carousel container. And then I'm using Flexbox here to set the position of the child elements. So horizontally, I'm setting them to appear in the center, and then vertically, I'm pushing them down to the bottom using align items and align content. Now I'm using wrap here because I'm setting the width of the description element to 100%, which is going to push everything else so that the description appears on its own row. If I was to get rid of wrap, you'll see what the problem is. They're all down here on their own row. So I want the description to take up an entire row, and for that to force a new line from the Flexbox. Next, I'm setting the Z index of all elements inside of the nav element to 10. So this makes them appear in a foreground layer. If I wasn't to set this, then they wouldn't be visible in front of the image. So it's very important to set this index. And also I set a background color that's black with an alpha of 0.6, so you can see the text a little bit more easily while still being able to see a little bit of the image underneath. So for the text inside of description, this is pretty standard stuff. Text aligned to center to make sure it's centrally placed. So for the dots element, which is on its own line, I'm using Flexbox to position the children inside it, which are the dots. So I'm using justify content to make it central, and you should set the width to 100% so the background fills the entire width of the carousel. So the dots themselves, they're just elements within the dots container, each one with a class value of dot. So these aren't there in the markup already, these are auto-populated by JavaScript. So you can create dots quite easily using pure CSS by just setting a width and a height and a background color, and also a border radius of 50% to make them into circles. And then I'm setting cursor pointer at the end, so when you hover over them, you can see it changes to the pointer. So the final important point is to set a background color that stands out for the currently active dot, that is the dot that has the active class attached to it. So we're going to be adding and removing that using JavaScript in the same way that we're going to be adding and removing the active class from the images. Now, so that you understand what's going on in the JavaScript, I've removed a lot of it, apart from some initial selections and some initial values that I've set. So first of all, I've selected all of the images that are inside the carousel using query selector all. So I've got the images in a list format that I can iterate through. I've also selected the dots container and also the description container, and the values that I've set are the speed for the carousel, so this is measured in milliseconds, and I'm putting this at the top so it's easy to find and change later on rather than being tucked away in a set interval function. And I'm also setting a value for index, so I want to start at the first image, which is going to be at position 0. And then finally, I'm declaring an interval ID variable without actually assigning a value to it. So I am going to be assigning the value of the set interval function that I use to animate the carousel, and then I will have that stored in a global variable, which I can then use to clear the interval when the user clicks on one of the dots. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to write a function that's going to increase the value of index by 1 every 3 seconds. So I'll call this function start interval. And inside here, I'm going to call the set interval function. This takes a callback function, and as a second argument, how often it's going to run. So I'll put the value of speed there, and then every time this runs, I want the value of index to increase by 1. Now, increasing the value of index doesn't really do much on its own. So what I want to do after I've increased the index is update the content inside of the carousel. So I'm calling a function here that I'm going to define down here, update content. So to update the content in terms of the image and the navigation, it's a case of manipulating the active class that is attached to the elements. So the first thing I'm going to do is to iterate through each of the images. So I'm going to do that by using the forEach method. Now inside of the forEach function, I have item available to me, so that's each of the images, and I want to remove from their class list the active value. Now if the active value is not set on an image, then it won't make any difference, it just won't remove anything from the image. So this is just making sure that all of the images have the active class removed before we set the active class to the image that's currently at the index value. So again, we say class list, this time add, and you want to add the active class to it. Okay, so I've defined both these functions so far, but I haven't called either of them. So I'm going to call them in the global scope so that they both start upon page load. Now let's take a look if that's working so far. We should see the images rotating through, but at some point when we reach the end of the images, we're going to encounter a problem, and that is that there's no more images. So the index has reached the end of the available images and it needs to return to 0 so we can see the first image again. So for this you can insert an if statement after increasing index by 1. So if index equals images.length, which is the length of all the images in the markup, then what you want to do is set the value of index back to 0. So now when we take a look at the gallery again, so it's going to take a little bit of time. Hopefully we should see the first image again. So this is the last one. So we're back again to the first image and we're going to cycle through again. Now the next thing to do in the update content function would be to update the active class for the navigation dots, but these haven't been created yet, so these are not in the markup. We've only got a container here and we're going to be populating them with JavaScript. So before doing anything else in the update content function, let's create those dots now. Now there should be as many dots as there are images. So to iterate that many times, I'm going to apply forEach to the images list, not because I want to make any changes to images, but just because that iterates the correct number of times. And inside here, I have available to me each image, which I'm not going to change. The important bit is we have I here, so this is keeping track of the iteration number starting at 0 and increasing by 1 for each iteration. So the first thing I want to do is to create a span element, and then what I'm going to do is set the class list on this span element by calling class name. So I want this to be a dot. So by setting this, each span that I create with a class name of dot, it corresponds to the CSS here, where each dot element inside of the dots container is going to be a dot thanks to the CSS that we created earlier. Now if the dot happens to be the first one, so we can check for that. If I equals 0, then we want to add to the class list the active class. So that's going to be a bright white to distinguish between it and the other dots. Now the next thing we want to do is to add an event listener to each of the dots, because the user should be able to click on them and change the image in the carousel. So what you want to do when a user clicks on one of these is to set the global index value to I. So that's corresponding to the image and dot that the user has clicked on. So index should be equal to I, and then after you've set I, what you want to do is to start an interval again, and you also want to run update content. And then what you want to do at the end of each iteration is, of course, append each span so it appears in the DOM. So each dot should appear in the dots container. So I'll append span in the dots container, and let's take a look at this in the browser now. So the dots are there, and it's going to change the image that's being displayed. So that's good, but there are two problems here. So first of all, I didn't actually end the interval, so we're getting this kind of weird behavior that's going on, and also we're not updating the active on the dots. So let's fix that now. So the issue with the images is caused by calling setInterval, which has already been called without ending the previous interval. So what we're going to do is to make use of this global interval ID that I declared earlier. So I'm going to save the return value of calling setInterval into it. So that's going to save an ID for the timer we have created. And then what I'm going to do is to check at the beginning of the start interval function if interval ID has any value, meaning that an ID has been assigned to it. In that case, what I want to do is clear interval, passing in interval ID. So the first time this runs, there'll be no value for interval ID. So this if statement will be skipped over and a new interval will be set. Subsequently, if an interval's already been set, then this if statement will find out that there is an ID value, and it's going to clear that timer before a new one is set. So now when we go back to the browser, you'll see that the behavior is normal for the timing of the images. Okay, so now we're ready to return to update content. Now the strategy here for updating the dots is very similar to images, where we're clearing the active class first of all, and then setting an active class for the image currently at the index value. But first of all, what we have to do is to select all of the dots, because they didn't exist initially, so we didn't select them at the top of the script. So I want to select all of the elements with the class value of dot. So I'm going to save all of those elements in an iterable list called dots, and I can apply the for each method to it, just like I did for the images. And each of those items, I can just copy and paste this actually. I want to remove the active class from all of them, and then next I'm going to select the one that's currently at the value of index and add the active class to it. Okay, so let's take a look at this on the page now. So the dot should be updating along with the images, and when I click on one of the dots, the active class is being applied to the dot that I'm currently clicking on. So that's happening because the index is updated, and then the update content function is running, setting the active class to that particular dot. And otherwise it's running through the interval that we programmed earlier. So if you don't want to add a description, you're actually pretty much done now. But what I'm going to do now is show you how you can add text that is in a description attribute on each of the images just above the user control dots. So the data on each element is saved as a data attribute. So the name of each of the attributes is desk. So if I go down here, what I want to do is to set the value of the desk element, which I already selected. So I want to set the text content of that to the value of that dataset attribute on each of the images. So I can do that by setting the text content inside of the desk element. So I selected the desk element at the top of the script, and I want to get the data attribute of desk for the current image. So I want to get images at the current index, and I want to access its data set, and I want to get the value of the desk data attribute. So that's all the code that you need for updating the description. You don't have to do any of the removal like we did for the active class before, because text content is overwriting the current value each time this update content function is called. So let's take a look at this on the page now, and this should now be identical to what I showed you at the beginning of this tutorial. So I'll just click around, just check that everything is working. So this is how you can create an image carousel with vanilla JavaScript without any kind of external library. I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you did, please consider hitting the like button down below this video. And if you'd like to see more content like this from us in the future, don't forget you can subscribe to the channel.